All right, my name is Don Fowler. I'm Emeritus faculty from the University of Nevada, Reno. Okay, well, I actually got into archaeology inadvertently. Had no intention originally of becoming an archaeologist. In my freshman year, I took an anthropology class at a junior college, and the instructor was this brilliant, very interesting guy who taught philosophy, anthropology, psychology, comparative religion, and I got interested in anthropology because I had grown up in Utah and Mormondom, and I had great disagreements about their views on race because I grew up in Ogden, Utah, which was a mixed race city, the only one in the state. So that was the beginning, and I took his class, and I thought, I want to be an anthropologist. So he sent me to University of Utah to meet Professor Jesse Jennings, who was chair of the department at that time. And I told him that I wanted to come and be an anthropology major, and he said to me, do you think you can get past your background? In other words, your Mormon background. And I said, I don't really have a Mormon background. I'm out of it. So I got a job. I had to work my way through school. My family were not in good state. So I worked 40 hours a week in hospitals to go to school. And the end of my sophomore year, I'd gone to California to see my parents and came back. And Jennings said, where the hell have you been? And I said, well, I've gone away. And he said, well, be here tomorrow. You're going to go to work in the lab. So the next day I found that I was now a student employee at the University of Utah, scrubbing potsherds and putting numbers on them. And at the end of September, this is 1957, and something called the Glen Canyon Archaeological Project was about to start. And at the end of September, he called me in one day and he said, go buy some field clothes, some boots, and a sleeping bag. You're going out in the field with Jim Gunnarsson. And you can come back and you can go to school again, start school again in the winter quarter. So we did. I had never camped out. I had no intention of ever doing like that. We were out for 3 months in sites along the Escalante River, which were feeding into Glen Canyon. This is just before the Glen Canyon project was officially started. So I came back in, and he called me in his office and recited all my transgressions from not being the greatest field person. And he said, the project is going to start for big time in June. You are now in charge of buying all the equipment to equip 5 field crews and a field school that Bob Lister was going to run at a big site in Utah, what's now Anasazi State Park. So I did. With his guidance, I learned, we bought jeeps and boats and tents and shovels and everything you can imagine. And then in June of '58, 2 days before we were ready to go out on one of the 5 field crews, a graduate student who had just started at Yale named Bill Lipe showed up. And Jennings had hired him as crew chief because he'd had some more experience than I had, and he's a year older than I am. And so I became the assistant chief, and he was the crew chief. And there were 6 of us, and we went down to just above where they were building the dam, the Glen Canyon Dam, put our boats in the water, and another boat showed up, a river runner to help us haul the gear. And he said, now we're going to go 20 miles up the river to the confluence with the San Juan River. And there were 2 boats. One had 2 motors and a steering wheel in the front, and the other one was a regular motor boat with a thing, the thing you run to the back. And he looked at me and he said, get in the little boat and follow us. And I said, I don't know how to swim, and I've never run a motorboat. And he said, put your blankety-blank life jacket on, and this is how you run the motorboat. Let's go. So away we went. And we got 20 miles up the river to a place that he'd already picked out. He'd already been down the river and set up camp. And he was there 3 days, taught one of the guys how to cook a little bit, and away he went. And he said, now you do all the archaeology between here and Lee's Ferry, which is below the dam, but they were just starting to build it. Find the sites that are really interesting that you can sample, and you, Fowler, are mainly in charge of finding all these sites, surveying. So every day I was up and down the river with one another, the crews, finding all these sites, and Bill was in charge of digging them. And we did the assignment. And we were out for 3 weeks the first time, totally out of contact with anybody. And we finally came into Kanab, Utah, which was our supply point. Sent in the artifacts, sent in the notes. That was the idea, because he had established a lab in Salt Lake City, so everything would be processed while we were still in the field. And we called him and said, we're okay. We only had one case of poison ivy. And so away we went. And then the next year, we were on the river again. Bill was in charge of the excavation crew, and I was in charge of the survey crew again. And we started at the top end of the Grand Canyon and worked down. And we found all kinds of ancestral Puebloan sites, particularly one called Defiance House, that we called Defiance House, that had never been touched. There were big pots still sitting on the surface with food in them. The ladders were still in the kiva. The ashes were still in the fireplace. There was these great big 4-foot tall pictographs of guys with a club threatening. And if you look very closely at the spine of the University of Utah Press books, that guy's on there. That's their logo. That's the beginning of that. So then I graduated that spring, and the day before we were leaving the field, Jennings called me in and said, there's a new federal legislation called the National Defense Education Act, and the University of Utah has 3 of these 3-year fellowships, and you have one, despite my grade average. Well, it turned out, there was 2 things about it. One, it meant that I still worked for the Glen Canyon Project, but he didn't have to pay me in the winter. But on the other hand, it gave me a really good background in intellectual history, which was very good for me, because I later wrote the Laboratory for Anthropology and things like that that are intellectual history, so it was fine. So I worked for the Glen Canyon Project for 3 more years. And the last year I was working on it, he brought in a young undergraduate named Catherine Sweeney, who was also from my hometown, who I had never met, because she was a Catholic, I was a Mormon, opposite sides of town. And he'd hired her to do ethnography, ethnoarchaeology. So that's how Kay and I met. So I worked till 1962, through the summer of '62. Then I went off to Pittsburgh, because I'd been there the whole time. The idea was I was going to get a PhD at Pittsburgh, and obviously I was going to become Jennings' minion. But the Utah had a rule that if you were an undergraduate and a graduate, you had to go somewhere for a year. So I applied to Chicago and I got admitted there, but I applied to Pittsburgh and I got a big fat Mellon fellowship. I mean, I had 9 publications by that time. And so I went to Pittsburgh, and I got there and discovered I'm not there for a year, I'm there for 3 years, or either that or I have to leave. So I wrote Jennings and I said, I'm here under false pretense. And he said, stay. So I stayed. And then the next spring, I went back to Salt Lake, and Kay and I got married with Jennings and others, others there, and we both went to Pittsburgh. Now, there was another guy in the faculty named Warren D'azevedo, who had worked both in Africa and in the Great Basin, and Kay and I had actually met in one of his seminars. And he, in the meantime, had been hired at the University of Nevada to start an anthropology department on the recommendation of Robert Heiser and Fred Egan and Homer Stewart. And so they hired him, and then he brought us there the next year. And I became, as soon as I finished, an assistant professor. And Kay hadn't finished, but she was working for the Desert Research Institute, which had started. So in 1967, because she had found the John Wesley Powell ethnographic materials from the 19th century, I got an NSF postdoc and an NEH grant, and we went to the Smithsonian to work on John Wesley Powell's papers and his materials. Kay went back to Pittsburgh. She got a 3-year fellowship from Pittsburgh. She was there for 7 or 8 months, and then she came to Washington, and then we went back to Nevada. And just as an aside, we were there in Washington in 1967-68. The March on the Pentagon, the Poor People's Campaign, Martin Luther King was killed, the riots, we had ringside seat, the whole thing, just as an aside. So we went back to Nevada, and I was hired in the Desert Research Institute to found the Social Sciences Division, but I kept an appointment in the department. And that went on for a number of years, and it allowed me to hire a lot of students, which I did, and we had a lot of things going on. And we were doing, I had started a big archaeological survey in eastern and southern part of Nevada, and we were working on various things, various sites. And that was going fine. And then in 1978, an heiress of the King Ranch in Texas, whose name was Marietta Sugden, whose mother was named Mamie Clayburg, the Clayburgs and the Kings owned the ranch, created the first endowed chair in historic preservation in the United States and gave the money to UNR. And I sat down in the chair, so to say. That's the short version, okay? But I still had my appointment in anthropology. So here I was, I had an endowed chair. I started a historic preservation program. I was chairman of the department for 10 years. I had all kinds of contracts from the Bureau of Land Management and so on. So we had plenty of support for our students, and we were rolling along. In 1974, there was the famed and famous meeting in Denver, which you have probably heard about more than once, or will hear more about. And I went. And out of that, I became ultimately the leader in something called ASCA, the American Society for Conservation Archaeology. And then I got involved in SOPA, one way or another. And ultimately, that led me to be the chair of the SAA's Political Action Committee, where we did some things, including rewriting the Antiquities Act with Steve LeBlanc and Mark Michaels and Bob McGimsey and Ray Thompson, etc. So that was a very interesting thing to have been involved in. Very interesting indeed, the politics of getting that through. Then it was when the SAA had decided to get out of the AAA because it wasn't working. And part of the problem was Ed Lehman, who was the executive director for the AAA, who was he's a very arrogant man, let's just put it that way. And so, SAA pulled out. And when we pulled out, George Frizen was president, I was president-elect. And so we hired an executive director named Jerry Miller, which was one of the best things we ever did in our lives as SAA. And the thing I remember most about that was Frizen and I and Jerry going up to see Ed Lehman at the AAA office to get the corporate seal and the computer tapes. And Lehman leaned back in his chair and lit a cigar and blew smoke at us and said, "Without me, you guys will be on your ass in 3 years." And Jerry Miller said, "We'll see." And away we went. Okay? SAA has been in good shape ever since. Then in the spring of '87, while I was still president, Jerry called me one day and he said, "Can you go down to San Francisco and have breakfast with a guy named John Evans?" And I said, "Sure, it was a 40-minute flight from Reno." So I jumped on the 6 o'clock plane and I went to San Francisco and went to one of the hotels and met this guy. And we sat there all morning and talked, and I thought, this is the smartest man I've ever met in my life. And he had been a publisher in publishing, but he had become a guy who took nonprofit organizations from A to B and set them on their course. And so I thought, we have to hire this guy. There's no doubt about this. So this would have been in May of '87, and the meetings were in Toronto. And that year, well, it was before that. I met him because we went to the meetings, and I took all the background material that I had and told the board, we're going to hire this guy. And some of the board didn't like that. I won't name any names, but some of them didn't like it. But the ones who liked it, Patty Jo Watson, among others. So we hired John Evans. Now, the fact that SAA works the way it does now is because of the Evans report and what he did to make behind the scenes to make SAA change. So it was very important. So in '87, I got out of the archaeopolitics business, well, sort of, and went on. By that time, I was running a historic preservation program, and I was running an archaeology program, and I was chairman of the department, and and I had all these graduate students. And I say for the record that I had 23 graduate students, and 19 of them were women. And I'm very proud of that. And they all did very well, all 23 of them. Then, in 1994, there was a man named Joseph Kramer who had made his money after the Second World War in wildcat oil, who was interested in early folk in North America. But the research wasn't going fast enough to suit him. So his plan was to drop $1 million endowments on to various universities with the proviso that the income, and it had to be at least 6.5%, so $65,000 a year, be devoted to early man studies, that the director of the program could not get paid from that and could not be chairman of the department, had to devote time to that. Well, by that time, I had a big program going in northern Nevada and southern Oregon and northern California with the BLM. We were running field schools up there, which were very successful. And so I hired Fred Niles, you may know who Fred Niles is, one of the best geoarchaeologists ever. So I hired Fred Niles, and away we went, working on what was called the Sundance Archaeological Project. And we did that till I got to half-time, and then I hired Ted Gable to come in to take over the Sundance, and then he left to go to Texas A&M, and now Jeff Smith, who is now running it. Its name got changed because Kramer got mad at me. That's a whole other story, but the money's still there. So he ultimately endowed these 7 different universities, including SMU and Arizona and Kansas and us, and so on. And those projects still go. And he had told me that when he died, or when his wife died, there would be more money. Well, his wife finally died just last year. And at the moment, it appears that at least 5 of the 7, he was apparently not happy with a couple of them, but 5 of the 7, including Nevada, will get about $7 million apiece to help support their archaeology projects. Okay? So, ultimately, I managed to not get too much more involved in archaeopolitics, but one of the things that happened was when I was president, one of my former students came up to me and he points his finger at me and he said, you know, you've got all these students now that we're all out working in CRM, because I had been to that '74 conference and all that came of that. But we don't have any way to keep up. You, with all your contacts and all that, you need to start a continuing education program for CRM. So I went to the dean of continuing education, who was an old friend of mine, and I said, I have a deal for you. Well, the end result was we ran it for about 9 years. We ran about 350 seminars and short classes all over the country, all the way to Guam. Tom King taught courses for us in Guam. Joel Watkins and what's her name? Carol, the Cheyenne lawyer, taught consultation courses. We had courses in scientific stuff. We had a lot of courses in NAGPRA, because NAGPRA had gotten going by that time. So we did that for a long time, and in my Vita, there's a list of how many of those we actually did and what the thing's all about, but it was a very extensive thing. And when I retired in 1987, I gave it up because there were other programs doing that by that time. I was about to retire, but I was still going around the country doing things for the Smithsonian. And that included lectures on historic preservation. We were all over the country. It was a big program. It's very interesting. There was, in 1981, the Smithsonian brass decided that this is, after all, the National Museum, and maybe we ought to have an outreach program. But they didn't know what to do about it. But there was a woman named Charlene James who had another career and was back at American University getting a PhD in anthropology. And she read a little thing in the Washington Post about what the Smithsonian was talking about. So she went to them and said, here's what you need to do. You need to make contact with all these other cultural institutions around the country, museums and so on, and partner with them and use the address list from the Smithsonian magazine to let people know what you're doing, and create a thing called the Smithsonian Comes to Your Town. And you need to use the staff from the Smithsonian for your lectures and your associates like Don Fowler and Kay Fowler. So that's the way it started. And Kay and I did it for about 15 years. In fact, there was a point in time when I had my classes scheduled Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, so I could leave Thursday evening and not have to be back until Monday morning. And we were all over the country. It was a marvelous thing to do. And I lectured. I did a lecture called Indians, Artists, and Photographers. I did things on historic preservation because I was doing it by that time. Various other kinds of things. Kay did various things on Native American art. And then we started, through that program, doing 4-day seminars in Santa Fe, which was very difficult duty. I mean, we had to be in Santa Fe. We were staying at the El Dorado Hotel, and we were running 3 seminars at the same time. One was on Southwest literature, which included Tony Hillerman as one of the speakers. One was on Southwest art, which Kay was involved in, and I did one on history of Southwest anthropology. And I'd lecture in the morning, and then we'd take people around and talk about archaeology. We'd go to Bandelier, Pecos, and all that. So that was actually a way of outreaching, archaeology outreach, that would not otherwise have reached an audience, and it was all over the country. I mean, I went all the way from Greenwich, Connecticut, to San Diego, to Spokane, to all kinds of other places. So it was a lot of fun. But enough was enough. And the bean counters finally figured out it wasn't making any money. And so they cut it off. And that was the end of it. My research focus was originally in the northern Southwest when we were working in the Glen Canyon country. And then a little bit after we got to Nevada, because southeastern Nevada, where we did some pretty good work, was partly, in the later phases, was ancestral Puebloan. And then all the way up to, we had one site that started 7,000 years back and came all the way up to historic southern Paiute. Then most of the rest of it was, once I got involved in the Kramer, the Sundance project, then that was Mott Davis's son. Jonathan was a brilliant geoarchaeologist. He was killed in a car wreck. He used to live in Nevada. And his view was, if you're going to find the old stuff, you have to find the old dirt. So, as I told you, I hired Fred Niles to find the old dirt, and we did. So we were focused on early stuff, early sites, and we did quite a number of them. But at the same time, I always had the interest in the history of anthropology, and that's when I did the Laboratory for Anthropology book. And then ultimately I did the Glen Canyon Country, which was a history of the Glen Canyon, and in the back of it was the Utah and the Museum of Northern Arizona, which was the other partner I haven't mentioned them, I should. The other partner in the Glen Canyon project, and the field director for that was Alexander Lindsay. And as you may recall, Lex Lindsay and Bill Leip were the ones who published the paper from the Denver conference that set CRM on its course. And they were responsible for that, get it going. So Lex just died a couple of years ago. He was a great friend. But he ran the Northern Arizona side, and Utah ran the other side for a number of years. And there were a lot of other people involved in it. Ultimately, the project itself had way over 200 people work for it, off and on both sides. There are about 200 publications. Everything that was ever done got published within at least 3 or 4 years by the time the project was over. That was the Jennings standard, and even Northern Arizona, which took a little easier, went with that. And then all these people got PhDs, I mean, all over the place. Bill went to Yale, you know. I went to Pittsburgh. Kay went here and there. One of our crew members became a now world famous astrophysicist. A guy named Peter Bodenheimer was on the river with us in 1958. There were David Dibble, who worked for the Texas Archaeological Survey, worked for Glen Canyon. Deanne Story was the first lab manager for the Glen Canyon project. She was then Deanne Soom before she married Hal. So she worked on the project. Kay did, as doing the ethnoarchaeology. So a lot of people got a pretty good start from that project. And what I learned from that was get it published, you know, encourage your students, use the money you can raise to support your students. And I supported every student I had, one way or another. Being chairman of the department for 10 years made it a little easier, but I still managed to support everybody. So that's what I've done. And I'm still doing it. Well, even before retirement, I got very much involved in the ethics side of the profession. And I wound up writing a number of articles about ethics. I wound up hosting some SAA committees at Reno when we were running the continuing ed thing on ethics. So I did a lot of that. I did with a couple of my students, I did a big article on ethics internationally, archaeological ethics. It's in that big handbook Handbook of Archaeology that came out. So I'm much involved in that for a long time. I very much enjoyed being president. It was because it was very exciting. It was very opportune. We were out on our own. Society was out on its own, and we had some really good board members. I mean, and the people who followed me as president, Jerry Sabloff, Dina Dinkows, Bruce Smith was secretary when I was president, and we've gone on from there, and we've done very well. And I'm going to see them all for lunch. Many of them are here. So I'm very pleased. I'm very pleased to have been part of SAA, particularly inadvertently starting when we did, because I think we've done very well, and we've always figured out how to hire the next executive director who did the right thing, and certainly from Jerry Miller on to Toby, and now I haven't met Uni yet, but I assume I will. Maybe today. I think SAA is in really good shape, and it's because of everybody who's involved in it. And I think one of the reasons it is because Dave Thomas says archaeology is a team sport, and unlike ethnographers, which is not. I won't put all this on tape, but I will simply say that I was appointed some years ago to a committee by the AAA to find them a fundraiser. And Sidel Silverman, who by the way just died 2 weeks ago, and Jerry Sabloff and some other people and I spent a great deal of time doing some headhunting and finding them a really good fundraiser. And they hired him, and at the next board meeting, the board said, "Oh, we don't need a fundraiser," so they fired him. At that point, I resigned from the AAA. They work differently. It's a different thing. Everybody's, they're all individuals. It's not the team sport that archaeology is. So, yeah. Part of the background for that, I think, has to do with the old guard. I mean, particularly the ones who came up in the 30s, like Gordon Willey and Jennings, and George Quimby and so on. And it was the old boys, and they were all in World War II and on and on and on, but it was still the old boys. And women's jobs were to wash the potsherds. Now, as a matter of fact, there's a brand new article in El Palacio magazine by Kay Fowler and Nancy Priso just exactly about that subject, about women coming into Southwestern archaeology. But in my case, I had lots of students, and a lot of them were women. And they wanted to be archaeologists, and I said, fine, let's go to field school. We'll send you out in the field, make you crew chief, and go for it. And I think that was also happening in other departments. Not in some it wasn't, but in others it was. And also it had to do with the generation of Dina and Ruth Ann Knudsen, who just died, and Alice Kehoe and Annetta Cheek, and Natalie Woodbury, who was a very, very big behind the scenes, who commissioned themselves the Old Broads. Or Tom King called them the Pushy Broads, so for a while they became the Pushy Broads. And then Pat, who was always just, everybody looked up to Pat. She was just the symbol. Pat Jo Watson. And she was editor when I was president. And Dina was president-elect. And it started from there. And other departments started bringing in more women, and it just went from there. But in our case, we didn't make any distinction. You're good, your grades are good, you want to go out in the field? Fine. Let's go do it. One other thing that I should be on record, because it isn't very well known. In 1985, when the push for reburial was really getting going from the Indians, and SAA was getting a lot of pressure, and I was president. And so Dina and I and the board talked about what we might do, and one of the things we thought we might do was get about a half a dozen or more archaeologists and about a half a dozen or more Native Americans around a table and talk about what kind of thing could be done to make this a better thing. So I called up the secretary of the National Geographic Research Committee, whom I happen to know, and I said, I need $20,000 next week or the week after, because we've had an offer from the Newberry Library as a place to meet, and we're going to bring Native Americans and archaeologists together and see what common ground we have and see what we can do. And the guy literally said to me, where do you want me to send the check? It was as simple as that. And then we got some more money from the Conoco Foundation, and we met in Chicago. I went around and met several Native Americans that I knew in the West. Dina knew some in the East, and other people knew some from the Midwest. And we sat around that table for 3 days, 3.5 days, and we hammered out a consensus document about what should happen. And that it was published and circulated, but not really very widely. But that was the beginning of SAA's formal involvement in what became NAGPRA. And then, of course, Vin Stepanitis and Keith Kinty and others who were then, and Lynn Goldstein too, who were then still actually kept it going. But that was a first step that most people don't even know about. But it was quite a remarkable thing. I view archaeology today as being alive and well, but I think beginning to fragment, theoretically. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But all you have to do is look at the current program, and you will see that there's all sorts of things now, sessions going on and whatnot, about ontology and about all of this and that and the other. And that's fine. It's intellectual growth. They're not still just simply worrying about how many potsherds came out of Y and how many arrowheads came out of Z. I think that's fine. I think the fact that there are Are there more women than men members now, or close to it? I think so. I think that's great, because there's that's more toward a parity. And the ones I know, a lot of them are now full professors. They're tenured professors and they're doing fine. So, and that's all something I've watched happen for the past 40 years or so, and I think that's great. The principal problem in archaeology and a lot of other sciences have for the next while is surviving in the current climate. Let's put it that way. On the other hand, a lot of things are particularly going on in the West about the Bears Ears and all of that. The fact that archaeologists and Native Americans are working together on that, I think, is great. Some of the other things I think that have happened in archaeology that are really quite remarkable is Bill Doley's career, the founder of Archaeology Southwest, and all that he's done. Absolutely remarkable. I saw him start when in 1980, this is something else that ought to be on the record, I think. In 1980, the Air Force proposed something called MX missile. So they're going to run these huge missiles around Nevada and Utah and desert, presumably with atomic warheads on them. And the idea was that they'd be moving all the time so the Russians wouldn't know where they were, and it was absolutely absurd. But there were two young graduate students from Arizona named Bill Doley and Linda Mayrew, who had just gotten married and who were hired by one of the engineering firms that worked for the Air Force. I was hired by both sides to be the archaeological gadfly, to sort of oversee how it was all going. And when the Air Force said to Bill and Linda, you have to fake your data, they said, we quit. And they left. And that I have greatly admired ever since. I greatly admire the both of them. I've been on Bill's advisory board for a long time at his request. What he's done with Archaeology Southwest and all the other things like that are done remarkable. That kind of thing. The thing that Jeff Altschul created is another good example of the kind of outreach. Lynn Sebastian's been involved in that, a lot of other people. That kind of thing is terrific, because it says to archaeology, you got to get out past your potsherds and arrowheads and get out and work with the rest of the community in the world, and they are. I think they're in great shape. I think the society's in just fine, and I'm terribly pleased. But the other thing is, there's a publication that's actually over on the table from Utah, from the Great Basin Conference from 2 years ago. And I have a paper in there. It's called "What is CRM? Where is CRM now in the Great Basin?" Because I did a paper 25 years ago about where it was then. And one of the things I have in there is a list and a summary of all the avocational groups in the West, and how many of them there are, and how the professionals work with them. And there's a lot more of that going on in every state. Yeah. So that's another thing that I think is very positive. In 1988, we got a phone call, Kay and I got a phone call from a man named Don Fraser, who lived in Scottsdale, but also in New Jersey. And he wanted to know if we were coming to the AAA meeting in Phoenix that fall. And we said yes. And he said, "Can I take you to dinner?" And we said, "Sure." And then I got thinking, I know that guy somehow, and I'll tell you how. So he came, got us, and we went out to Paradise Valley, where he had a house. We met his wife, and we went to the Camelback Inn to have dinner. And in the middle of dinner, he said, "If I started giving you money for archaeology, what would you do with it?" And I said, "Well, I have a lot of hungry graduate students, and I would use it for that, and we always need some equipment and so on, but mainly I'd mainly use it for graduate students." Okay. So this is November, in about January, and it was always after he'd talked to his accountants from the IRS, comes a check for $15,000 made out at the university with a note that said, "I send it, you spend it, I don't want an accounting." Okay, so I created the Fraser graduate fellowships to support graduate students. And the next year he sent $20,000. And then he called up one day and he said, "You're running your field school now up in Warner Valley." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "How much is he said, "What's the tuition?" And I said, "It's $500. And he said, "Can I come on the field school?" And I said, "Sure, anybody can go on the field school." So it comes a check for $5,000 for his tuition for the field school. And he shows up and did everything all the students did, including washing the dishes and everything else. Loved it. And then after the field school, I had lots of BLM contracts, and I was sending the graduate students out to do them, and so he'd go out with them, and he loved it. And so he did it for quite a number of years. And then when I retired, he called me up one day and he said, "I'm going to be in Reno, and I want you to come with me to go to the foundation, and the Honor Foundation." And I said, "Okay." So we went down there, and he said to the foundation, "Here's a check for $250,000. It's the beginning of the Don Fowler Endowment in Great Basin Archaeology." Okay? He died about a year and a half ago. By that time, the Fowler Endowment was $650,000, which was being used for graduate student support, the interest because of the foundation. And in his will is endowed chair, the Don Fowler chair. Well, I fixed it with his attorney that it's the Don Fowler, Don Fraser chair in Great Basin Archaeology. And it's going to be, it hasn't been formally announced yet because he died a year or so ago, but the estate's taken long time to sell the estate. And when the estate's all settled, the university will formally announce it, and I know who's going to be who's going to sit in the chair. So just one of those things. But the reason for all this is that he was from Massachusetts. He came out to Nevada in the early 30s with his mother because she came to get a divorce. And she bought a horse ranch and stayed. So he grew up in Nevada. And he was in the Air Corps, Army Air Corps in World War II. And then he went back to Massachusetts after the war, and he got into the steel shelving business, selling industrial shelving. And that led ultimately to Fraser Industries, which is the biggest manufacturer. They build automated warehouses. It's the biggest company of its kind in the world. And he was the sole owner. So he endowed the chair. So I feel like a very nice guy, very, and he loved it. He loved to go out with the students. He loved the whole thing, and he helped a lot of the students, do their field work over and above the survey stuff. If they were out digging their sites for their thesis, there he was. So it's nice to have people like that who are interested in doing things and doing it because they enjoy doing it. And they did. Great guy.